Hello. Yes, this is as strange for me as it is for you. I want to welcome everyone who has blessed me with their company over the years, and those of you who are joining me for the first time for my live rendition of A Christmas Carol. Now, come quarantine, come election, come hell or high water, there was no chance in hell that I was not going to be giving this performance. And the truth of the matter is that this is the only performance that gets me through the year. That's right. I have a very shallow, very unfulfilling life. And every single year I just look forward to this one moment where I get to have my ego fest and I get to tell this story, and all of you need to suck it up and listen to it. And yes, I'm talking directly to you. No one else in the audience matters, except for the person who I am looking into right now. Now, something you're going to notice about this performance this year is that we don't have a live audience element. So it's going to be a lot like one of those NBC live musicals, but the only difference is going to be the fact that while Matthew Morrison was exuding a wild sexual energy, I'm going to be exuding a thrilling sexual energy. Yes, my goal by the end of the night is to get you hard as a rock. So you have that to look forward to tonight. And so this year, I'm not going to be giving you all of the dramatics that you may have come to expect from my performance, but I am going to try and give you the meat and potatoes of the story. And more than anything, my goal tonight is I want to share with you why I think that this story is more pertinent than ever. I mean, when you really get down to it, I think that because of quarantine, because of the fact that so many of us are home, because of the fact that so many of us have had our lives interrupted, I think that we are being forced to stop and critically think about what the world has become and where we think the world is heading. And we're being very mindful of our past, present, and future. And I think that as we consider all of that, we're really thinking about the fact that we are so divided and so separated, and humanity has sort of not become the goal anymore. You know, it's just become factions that are butting heads with each other and all these different political aims that need to be met. And the humanity never seems to be at the center of the discussion. And so what I want to do tonight, and what I want to do with you there at home, is I want to do what I did every year with you guys when I would do this live. But in particular, I want to talk about A Christmas Carol, and I want to talk about this year and why we can look to this story as inspiration for how we should be moving forward. And so what you can anticipate from me now moving forward is you're going to get to see the nerdiness that I've given you every year. I mean, I'm pretty pathetic, so you're going to get to laugh at me as I kind of just nerd off and show you how much I'm obsessed with this story. But I also want to go with sort of a fine-toothed brush, and I want to give you guys a real taste of what's at the heart of this novella and how it applies to the world today. And so I ask you to please sit back, join me in cracking open your favorite Christmas punch. I'm not going for a hearty, spiced orange punch this year. I'm actually going for my grandmother's recipe. It's called a wit clow, a wit clow hard seltzer. It's my grandmother's recipe. And I want you to sit back and enjoy as we try to tackle this story. Why does this story have staying power? You know, the interesting thing is that most stories take the trajectory of the oral storytelling tradition. They're stories that were first told around the fire, and they were told to the young people of a village or of a society to educate them about what to do, what not to do, what lessons to carry with them. And eventually what happens is that somebody decides they're going to write that story down. You know, look at Cinderella, the rags to riches story, a story that almost every culture has some version of. And then eventually people like Charles Perrault or the Grimm's brothers decided that they were going to record it on paper finally. But what's so interesting about A Christmas Carol is that A Christmas Carol had the reverse trajectory. A Christmas Carol started as a periodical. It was actually published in the newspaper by Dickens. And what's so interesting about that is the fact that it was only after that that the world chose to take ownership of it. In fact, A Christmas Carol was such a hit from the get-go that there were actual illegal copyright violated publications of it that were circulating. And there were all of these unlicensed theater productions that were going up all throughout England. And people just went gaga for the thing. And of course, that begs the question of why. Why did Dickens choose to tell this story in the first place? Dickens had had a rough childhood. He, as a young boy, lost his father. His father was taken away to a debtor's prison, and he was forced to go and work in a shoe factory. They actually called him the little gentleman because of the fact that he was actually fairly well learned and well read. And that sort of established early on in the back of his head this idea of just how awful class stratification could be, and the impending industrial revolution that was developing and happening in England. And it wasn't until he made a trip, as an adult, he had become a successful writer, and he had written this complete bomb of a book called Martin Chuzzlewit. And it was a huge failure. He was at the bottom of the barrel, and he decided to make this big trip out to go and see the Cornish tin mines, where there were a bunch of kids who were working the mines. And I mean, it was this awful labor situation of 14-hour days, and they were dirty and they were uneducated. And I mean, it was just abhorrent. And what happened was he was so moved by this and by this idea of the fact that England was a society in which people were viewed as commodities, in which you had the workhouses and the treadmills. You had people who were cogs in the machine and were being used to create a product, and they were just interchangeable, that he decided he wanted to write a story that was sort of, you know, his message to the world. And the way that any great freedom writer, you know, goes about telling their story, and I'm thinking of Elie Wiesel and Maya Angelou and fantastic freedom writers, they always find a way to capture that moment in history and to use their art, to use their storytelling, to try and twist the framework of society and to really, you know, do some social engineering and get people to realize what's going on. And that's what A Christmas Carol was, and still is arguably, was that it was Dickens saying to the world that we collectively are the Scrooge, and that we all need to stop and we need to take stock, and we now need to consider what is it that each of us can do individually, you know, as a part to, you know, frack away at the whole and to try and make a society that is more compassionate, that is more kind, and frankly is more human-centric, is centered around the survival of humanity and the human soul and the human spirit. Marley was dead to begin with, dead as a doornail. That's how Dickens is choosing to start off his Christmas story. The interesting thing about Victorian Christmas culture is that not only would this novella contribute so much to the image and the idea that the Western world had of what a Christmas celebration should be, but it also captures perhaps one of the greatest traditions of Victorian English Christmas, and that is the ghost story. Families would gather around the fireplace, they would sit at the hearth, and they would tell spine-chilling stories. And what is so lovely about this little ghost story, that's how Dickens described it, is that this ghost story involves a man who is not haunted by ghosts, but is haunted by himself. At the beginning of the story, we're introduced to Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's described as a squeezing, clenching, covetous old sinner. Perfectly inhuman is how he's described. He is somebody who, when the blind man's dog sees him coming on, it'll tug his owner into a doorway. Nobody will ever go up to Scrooge in the street to bestow a trifle upon him. No, Scrooge is an everyman. Scrooge is the collective Victorian identity. It is who these people were at the time, a people who were so disconnected from humanity, who had built such walls up around themselves and had accepted a society that oppresses people, a society where compassion, where kindness, where selflessness, and not the pursuit of material gain can survive. And so when we go to Scrooge's money-changing hole, when we go to his firm, Scrooge and Marley, we literally see the walls that Scrooge has built around himself to protect him from the outside world. Who is able to squeeze through the cracks? First off, we have Scrooge's nephew, Fred, and I think that Fred has one of the most moving, most poignant monologues in the entire novella when talking about humanity and why he continues to have faith in humanity. Nephew Fred says that he just feels that Christmas is the one time in which people don't look upon each other as other creatures as much as they do as fellow passengers to the grave. And what I think is just so striking about that line, this idea of how we're all fellow passengers to the grave, is that that is really what we've all been meditating on since quarantine began. I mean, when you really think about it, we were all called on to protect our neighbors. So many of us are privileged enough that we feel that because of our age or because of our health or whatever demographic, we feel that we are invincible to COVID. And whether that be true or not, we have all been called on to be compassionate towards others, to be considerate of those who might be more susceptible and vulnerable to the throes of COVID. And so what Nephew Fred is really speaking to is this idea of how you need to look beyond the self. When Scrooge looks at Nephew Fred, he sees a man who married not for money. He sees a man who is not investing all of his interests in the pursuit of wealth. He sees a man who is just dabbling in nonsense. But that nonsense to Nephew Fred is humanity. He sees it as that he is building up his family. He is building up his community. When he walks through the door into the counting house, he goes right past Scrooge's clerk, Bob Cratchit. And he gives Bob Cratchit the regard that he would give the master of that establishment. He's just the lowly clerk. And yet he looks upon Bob Cratchit as a fellow passenger to the grave. He asks Bob Cratchit how his family is. And that is just a testament to the difference in the quality of spirit that Scrooge and his nephew have. And so once Nephew Fred has moved on and is out of the picture, we have two seekers of mercy, and a seeker of mercy is otherwise a charity collector. And this is where we get the famous, lines that everyone just loves so much. If they're going to die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? I mean, the thing about the charity collectors is that they represent an interest that is independent to the state. Scrooge says that he pays his taxes to go towards the treadmills and to go towards the workhouses, and that because he pays his taxes, that because of the fact that he's putting his faith and his trust into the institutions that are supposed to uphold society, that's enough, that he doesn't have to worry any further. And that is something that we are all living right now, which is that, over on Capitol Hill or even here in New York State up in Albany, they're fighting about what is the best response to COVID, to the shutdowns, to this moment in history that we're living in. But at the end of the day, when you really get down to it, the people who are effectuating change in the community, it's us. We are the ones who are making the choices that are going to make or break us at the end of the day. And if that's as simple as wearing a mask to the grocery store, or reaching out to your local food banks, especially after the holidays when they're really going to need to be replenished. I mean, it's just all the little things that we do, that we don't lean on the government or even corporations to answer for us. And so we end up leaving Scrooge's counting house on the final note of Scrooge telling Bob Cratchit to be sure to come in earlier the next day. Of course, Bob Cratchit wants to have off for Christmas Day, and Scrooge has that wonderful line of, Christmas is nothing more than a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Again, this idea of how there's a disconnect between Scrooge and any notions of compassion, that he should be giving something even though he's not being given anything in return. And that is eventually what propels us into the night of all nights that's going to change Scrooge's life. This is my favorite Christmas decoration. My aunt made it for my mom years ago, and I'm going to make sure I get it when she dies.
All right, Dan, you ready?
Yes.
We have 90 seconds on the clock for you to go through 15 different Christmas Carol adaptations from as recent as 2019 to how early? 62?
Oh boy, we're going back to 1951.
All right, 51. 51 to 2020, that is, wait, what is that, 70 years of Christmas Carol?
Oh my god, yeah, something like that. We got 14 names up here.
Whatever, all right. That's 90 seconds on the clock. Mag, set us in intervals. We're going to go in 3, 2, 1, go!
All right, we're going. And first we have Scrooge, 1951. This is Alistair Sim, the definitive version for so many different people, produced in England but became a hit in the States. We have Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol. This was the first Christmas special ever on TV. Raspberry dressing for the win. Yes, what else do we have? Oh, we have the Scooby-Doo version. It was an old episode with Scrappy-Doo when they did that Scrappy and Shaggy and Scooby. Really not worth it. What else do we have? We have the Flintstones in 1984. Mr. Slate plays Marley. Hey, it's Bedrock. A lot of dinosaur puns. Not very good, but we like it enough. Also, there's okay, and then we have Christmas Carol the movie. Nicolas Cage was in that. It was really bad. We have the 1971 Alistair Sim again in a cartoon. George C. Scott. My favorite version, Watch It with Mrs. B. Scrooge, 1970 with Albert Finney. I hate him in this. Leslie Bricusse, the Willy Wonka song makers, made the songs for this. They're good, but I hate Alistair Sim in it. Patrick Stewart in 1999. He was way too serious. He didn't change. Joel Grey played the Ghost of Christmas Past. Should have been Scrooge. Mickey's Christmas Carol. You really fucking cry when Tiny Tim dies. A Christmas Carol 2004. Really bad movie version with Jane Krakowski as a weird pole stripping Ghost of Christmas Past. Bah humbug. The Warner Brothers figured it out. Disney Xmas Carol. Jim Carrey was a nightmare in this. I hate Robert Zemeckis and everything he does. Guy Pearce last year BBC. Weird. It was just so weird. It was. I hated all of it, and that's basically. Oh no, the Muppets are great. I love Michael Caine. Michael Caine.
That one is pretty good.
A man's home is his castle, and especially for men who self-isolate like Scrooge, home is where you go to be in absolute solitude. And it is here, once he is home, that again we have this idea, this metaphor of the walls that Scrooge builds up around himself, the idea of the counting house separating himself from the rest of the world, and now he has his home, which again separates himself from the rest of the world. Now we are beginning to see the spirits infiltrate his home, actually having the ghost permeate through the walls of the house. And I think it's here that Charles Dickens was just one of the funniest writers. I mean, we all know that famous moment where Marley's head appears on the door knocker, and Dickens literally describes it as an old lobster that had gone bad in a cellar. I mean, who else could conjure imagery like that but someone like Dickens? And what's so crazy is that we are now in Scrooge's home, and we're now seeing the spirits beginning to conjure and beginning to materialize before Scrooge's eyes. And now we get into Marley. It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk far and broad amongst his fellow men. And if that spirit fails to do so in life, it is condemned to do so after death. Marley carries a lot of luggage with him. Luggage that he was never able to drop in life because he made the cognizant choice not to. And what's so interesting about Marley and this idea of a chain that's forged link by link and yard by yard is this idea of the suffering that we are able to impart on others because of our own suffering. You have people who are so tortured, like Scrooge, like Marley, that they have to separate themselves from the world, that they impart so much of their own suffering onto others. And what is most interesting, I would argue, about Marley's ghost is the fact that he is suffering in a way that I don't think most of us would find to be suffering. It's not the chains that cause Marley to suffer. It's not the weight and the length of the strong coil he has bared. Rather, it's the fact that he can't interfere for human good. The most stirring, the most chilling passage in the entire book, as far as I'm concerned, is when Scrooge looks out into the night and he sees phantoms, and they're all fettered, they're all chained like Marley, some of them chained at the waist because they're guilty governments or whatever. But there's one specter that stands out to Scrooge, and it's someone that Scrooge knew very well. It's a specter in a white waistcoat who has a monstrous iron safe shackled to his ankle. But what's most interesting about that is that the focus is not on the monstrous safe that is shackled to his ankle. The focus is not on the fact that he is doomed to wander through the world. What the focus is on is that this spirit is trying to interfere with a poor beggar woman who is swaddling her baby. The specter wants nothing more than to get involved and to do something to help. And isn't that what we all are trying to do right now? How many of us feel helpless right now? I mean, when you really think about what this year has been, how many of us have just watched what's going on in the news cycle or the scary COVID statistics that are popping up in our counties every day? And how many of us have just said, I just want to interfere for human good? And that's what is just so stirring about this passage. And about Marley's ghost and the whole concept in general is that, sure, they wear the chains and the burdens of what they've put on other people. You know, that's bad in itself, sure. But what's really scary is what Marley got to the heart too, which is that they must witness what they cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness. And I know that as we process the trauma of what 2020 has been, what COVID has been, we are all going to think to ourselves years from now, what more could I have done? And that propels us into the first spirit. And the first spirit is described as a ray of light that fills the room. And when Scrooge tries to focus his eyes and look upon the spirit, it's described as holding a stick of holly in its hand, but also having summer flowers upon its gown. And it's described as an older figure, but also youthful. It's sort of androgynous, and it's sort of all over the place, the description of what this being is supposed to be. And that's really supposed to capture the idea of a hazy memory. And that sort of carries us into what the entire Christmas past section is all about, is this idea of taking the past, the memories that are so hazy to us, and trying to re-render them and to find the details again and to learn the truth of it. The spirit, again, is described as this bright white light. And it's this idea that all of these blurry, unclear visions that we hold on to of what our lives have been can be re-examined, can be reapproached and held up to the truth. And it's hard of a pill to swallow when you really think about it, because all of us have parts of our lives that we wouldn't want to have to reflect on. I was a really big fan of Bay Bell cheese for about 12 years. And the thing you may not know, if you don't know this brand of cheese, is that it comes in these tiny wheels that have a red wax casing on them. And what you do is you take the red wax casing and you kind of strip away at it, and then you eat the cheese that's inside. I used to eat the wheels without taking the wax off. I thought it was kind of like pockets, where you have like that edible paper. And so essentially for about 12 years or so, I was ingesting crayons mixed with cheese. And the reason I say that is because I'm not so forward as to think that this is what Dickens had in mind when he was talking about just how horrifying it can be to hold up a light and a standard of truth to our memories of the past. But I think it's pretty damn close. It's really interesting because I don't think creatives know what to do with the Ghost of Christmas Past in most adaptations. Because I think that when you write a book, it's very easy to describe this androgynous, up-in-the-air figure, because the audience, the reader, gets to play in their head with what that might look like. And I think it's really hard to define that in many adaptations. I think that you get some really crappy literal interpretations of it, like the 2009 Christmas Carol with Jim Carrey, and then I think you get more creative ones. I'm a very big fan of the way the Muppets did it with the floating child Muppet and suspended in water. I thought that was a really cool effect. But I don't think anyone's ever been able to really capture that in the way that Dickens intended. Christmas Present is kind of like the uncle who shows up to Christmas, who definitely should not have driven himself, and you're really worried about him driving home. Like, he's really jolly and he's all bundled up and he's sitting in the corner and he's drinking on his grog, but you just know that this isn't going to end well. And, in Dickens, obviously, it ends with him having two starving children under his robe, whereas, for your uncle, it's probably going to end in a DWI, but Christmas Present really taps into, again, what I was talking about earlier, the idea of how a Victorian Christmas was captured in the Dickens novella. Because of the fact that when the Ghost of Christmas Present arrives, you have this incredible giant who has this animal skin robe and he has the big wreath of holly around his head, and there's succulent pigs and there's turkeys and there's all these different roasts and apples and all this bounty that surrounds the spirit. And it's sort of really the first time in modern Western literature that we begin to see this idea of Christmas being synonymous with abundance, with plenty. Because when you really think about it, a lot of times winter has always been associated with death, with little, with famine. And yes, you have always had the Christmas festival as this idea of celebrating, warmth within the greater cold and darkness. But I think this really is the first time that we get to see a depiction of Christmas that represents the indulgence that we know today. And with that said, I think that the spirit of Christmas Present really knows how to indulge in the finer things in life. We finally get to the Cratchit household, and I'm just going to be upfront. I think Tiny Tim rarely works in any depiction that's not in the book. I think that Tiny Tim is supposed to just stay a metaphor. He's supposed to, in the book, be personified hope. He's wise beyond his years. Like many children who have struggles and challenges that force them to grow up a bit sooner, he's just very wise, and he sort of represents this light and this ray of hope within this poor, starving family's humble house. And I think that's just very hard to capture on film. They're either too squeaky or they're too annoying, or sometimes they're just really well fed. Like there have been so many fat Tiny Tims that you really just have to question, like, who thought that this kid could play like a Dickensian starving like scrap rat, like gutter snipe? It's not that I'm saying that I think it's better when Tiny Tim dies. I think it just gets a lot quieter. I hate child actors. I think Annie is my worst nightmare. Like, my equivalent of water torture is easily any involvement in a production of Annie. A part of the story that just goes by in a blip, and I always find so much meaning in it, and it probably resonates with me more than most anything in the book, is when the spirit takes Scrooge to see almshouses and hospitals, sick beds, debtors' prisons, and everywhere that Scrooge goes, he just finds that people find a way to celebrate Christmas. They find the meaning in it. If I'm being honest with you, like, I am just dreading this Christmas. Not dreading it. I mean, I'm happy for it. I'm not going to get to see my extended family. I'm not going to get to see the people I love. But at the same time, it's nice that I am privileged enough to be home with my mother, my sister, and my grandparents, eating Chinese food, doing something we would normally not do. We're finding the best in that situation. And I recognize, too, that obviously that's a really privileged and, I'm so fortunate that that's how bad Christmas is going to be. But I will say, I think that more than ever I reflect on this idea of finding Christmas wherever you can. I'll also say, again, it all comes full circle. I didn't think I was going to go anywhere with the whole child actor thing, but Where Are You Christmas? I just can't stand that. I cannot stand the song. I can't stand the Jim Carrey Grinch. I will be the first to say I can't stand the Jim Carrey Grinch. I think it's horribly mean-spirited. I think that it sort of shoehorns in this generic moral about how we all need to learn the true meaning of Christmas, when the original meaning behind the moral in the original Grinch story is that it's not that the Who's are the problem, it's that the Grinch's perception of the Who's is the problem, that it's not the gifts they care about, it's that the gifts are a means to an end. And I just really don't like the Jim Carrey version for that. Although I think it's so interesting that they put Christine Baranski in a vehicle that really showed off her Who-like features. So you have the ghost of the president, who is this big jolly giant, and he just represents, again, the abundance and just the decadence and the warmth of the season. And from beneath his robe, he reveals these two children who are just so painfully malnourished that their hands look like claws because there's so little flesh on them. And it's this just beyond stirring realization that these two children, the girl's name is Want and the boy's name is Ignorance. And the spirit tells Scrooge to beware the boy because ignorance is going to be mankind's doom. What's so upsetting about Ignorance and Want is the fact that no matter how much you do, it's not going to do a whole lot in the bigger global picture. We recycle. We can individually recycle, and we should. I'm telling you at home, you should be recycling. But the reality of it is that there's a handful of individuals who make choices for industries that affect the environment more than any of us ever will be able to. And that no matter how much we do, that the devastation that is caused by that is going to largely be unaffected. And I think that's the thing about Ignorance and Want that really sticks with so many of us, is the fact that, wow, yes, I am doing my part. We know this whole book is about doing your part, and we've been talking so much about this idea of what we need to do. But sometimes no matter what you do, how much you do, it's just never going to fully go away. Like the children who are hidden in the robe, even though they are hidden, they still live. And all of that devastation, that despair, it all still lives on. And it just follows us like a specter, and that's scary. And Dickens continues to play with this idea of shadows that follows us into the future sequence. And the thing about the future sequence that has always stood out to me is the fact that it's all about how so much in life is uncontrollable, that what we can control, we need to master, and we need to keep a firm grip on. And where that is most expertly shown is when we focus in on the Cratchits. Now, in the future, obviously, the Cratchits lose Tiny Tim. He dies. And what happens is that the father, even though he has lost his quote-unquote poor little child, he's still able to find peace in the fact that he is still surrounded by his children and his wife. And he finds happiness. And that's the word he uses, because he describes himself as a happy man. He uses the word happiness to describe the fact that all of them can move forward with the memory of Tiny Tim. He calls on his children, he calls on his wife to never forget that when they're all eventually separated, when life takes them separate ways, that they never forget their Tiny Tim. And it really speaks to me so much, because of the fact that I think that that's all we can do more often than not. When the unexpected happens, when the tragic happens, we are sort of just left with what is controlled. And we have to make do with that. And again, that's where I think that we're playing with this idea of Scrooge and Cratchit being polar opposites, is this idea that Scrooge was dealt really bad cards and had a lot of heartbreak. And his response to it was, oh, like, I'm just going to become, harder and meaner for it so that I don't have to incur that kind of pain anymore. Whereas Cratchit, his response to the heartbreak that he incurs is, I am going to be kinder and better and a better provider for my family and give them the love that I can give them. And I'm going to share that love. And I think that that paired with the fact that then we're looking at Scrooge's future, a future in which after he's gone and the thieves are just taking the blankets off of his corpse and there is no happiness or joy to be found in memories of him, I think that that's just a really cool dichotomy that we see. Of the fact that, yes, Tiny Tim is gone, but his memory survives with his family and will live on, whereas the possessions that were taken from Scrooge after he dies are all that survive. And once, again, those grave robbers take what they can pick from his corpse, and once they can sell it, I mean, that's it. There's no value left to be found. And this is really what I want to zone in on. I had said at the beginning, I had talked about this idea of, how Scrooge is supposed to represent all of us, but I know people who really don't like the fact that Scrooge is redeemed in the end. Because of the fact that, they see that final titular scene of Scrooge in the graveyard and they see, him seeing his name on the gravestone and he gets really freaked out. And they do this surface level analysis, like the surface level take of it as, oh, he's scared of his death and he's scared of his future. And I think people completely miss the point when they take it that way. I think that Scrooge seeing his name on the headstone is not so much him being afraid of death, or even being afraid of what's become of him. I think it's more or less him realizing the totality of a life lived. The fact that what he has done, what he did, and what ultimately will be left after him, his legacy, is nothing. He left nothing but pain with people. He left nothing but hurt and heartbreak. And I think that's what grabs him more than anything, is a life that was not well lived. And when he says those immortal words of how, he wants to live in the past, the present, and the future, the spirit of all three will strive within him. That is such a powerful line that speaks to the fact that he wants to tear down those walls. Again, we have this imagery of walls. He wants to tear down those walls, and he wants to rejoin the human race. He wants to build those connections that he severed. And he's sort of ready to participate in what is greater than him. And that is what I think earns him his redemption in the end. Euphoria! Scrooge has been given another chance at life. He runs out into the street, does his whole redemption thing, and I think that this is the closest we get to this story running alongside Christmas themes. Again, this is a ghost story, not so much a Christmas story as we know it. But the thing about the Christmas story, obviously, is we know that Christ came to save us all, to redeem us for our sins, that by believing in Christ and living through him, that we can be forgiven too and we can achieve salvation. And that's the thing that kind of happens here with Scrooge when you think about it, is that not necessarily Christ, well, again, like the principles and the tenets of what Christ stood for, obviously, but we have these three spirits of past, present, and future, these spirits of Christmas, who Scrooge says he is going to live through and that he is going to move forward and make decisions in consideration of. And I think that that so much lines up with our notions of Christianity and our notions of what it is to be forgiven, and in turn, what it is to forgive others. Because that's the other thing, is that in order for Scrooge really to redeem himself, it's not only just about him making the effort on his end, it's also about the other people whom he's looking for forgiveness from to actually forgive him. And there's something really powerful about how, Scrooge goes to his nephew's house and stands on the steps of his nephew's doorway, and he is welcomed into the family. The family welcomes him home. The same way that the next day he meets his clerk and he extends goodwill to him. He's going to provide for Cratchit. He's going to see to it that Tiny Tim gets well. And Bob Cratchit accepts it. He accepts it over a bowl of punch, of all things. And I think that that kind of shows the fact that what this really comes down to is this idea of, again, forgiveness and sort of salvation through goodwill, through compassion, through all these Christian notions of what it is to be good and to be able to be redeemed, to be redeemable. And that is such a powerful note that we leave off on in the story. What's so interesting was that after the book was published, I mean, it sold like hotcakes. Like I said earlier, copies of the book sold out. There were multiple black market copies being sold, big theater productions going up all over England. But the year afterwards, there was this notable increase in the wealthy buying geese and turkeys and donating them to the poor. And there was this real sense of mindfulness that overtook a lot of people in English society, and making them really consider the fact that, wow, like maybe I should be mindful of the way that I've acquired wealth, the way that I consolidate wealth, and the impact that it's had on people, and how can I use my wealth, what I have, to give back. But even those who don't have wealth, because again, you look at people like the Cratchits who have absolutely nothing, and they still are able to find what they can give of their spirit to others. And of course, the person who stands tall and strong at the end of the story is Tiny Tim. Because Tiny Tim saves Scrooge as much as Scrooge saves Tiny Tim. Yes, Tiny Tim doesn't die. We know that, and that's because of the intervention that comes with Scrooge paying for all the medical needs and whatever. But just as much, it's through Tiny Tim's bold spirit, the spirit of a poor young child, that ultimately saves him. And that ultimately will save all of us, arguably. I want to give everyone a big thank you for joining us today. And I want you to remember that next year we will be back together and we'll be stronger than ever. And I want to give a super big thank you to all of our frontline workers who are keeping the world spinning right now. It is because of you that we get to be with our families and we get to be happy, healthy, and holy, and we thank you. If you are so inclined, we do ask that you please consider giving a donation to Long Island Cares, an organization that actively fights food insecurity. You'll find a link to where you can give a donation down below. Thank you, and God bless us, everyone.